Captain Dongsu stood on the bridge of the UES Perseverance, watching the stars through the main window and thinking about how far humanity had come in just 50 years since they first left Earth and began exploring the galaxy around them. The ship was quiet, except for the soft hum of engines and the occasional beep from control panels where his crew worked at their stations and monitored the deep space around them as they traveled toward the outer rim systems that no human had ever visited before communications. Officer Hye-jin sat at her station running routine scans of radio frequencies and checking for any signals that might indicate other life forms, when suddenly her equipment began picking up something that made her sit up straight and call for the captain to come look at what she was seeing. The signal was weak and broken, but clearly artificial and definitely not from any human source, which meant they had found evidence of alien life for the first time in human history, and Hye-jin worked quickly to clean up the transmission and make it clearer so they could understand what it was saying. As the static cleared, they could hear a voice speaking in a language they had never heard before, but the universal translator that Earth scientists had developed began working on the alien words and slowly started providing rough translations that appeared on the screen in front of them. The voice belonged to someone called Tal Eris, who was speaking with desperation and fear in his tone as he begged anyone who could hear his message to please help his people who were dying and being destroyed by enemies who showed no mercy to anyone, including women and children. Captain Dongsu listened carefully as more details came through the translator and learned that the speaker was from a species called the Villani, who lived on a water world called Aquaros, where they had built beautiful floating cities and lived in peace for thousands of years without ever harming anyone. But now their world was under attack by something called the Krathan Empire, which had arrived with massive warships and started bombing their cities and taking their people as slaves while stealing everything valuable from their planet, including the special minerals that grew in their deep oceans. Tal Eris explained that his people were peaceful and had never built weapons or trained for war because they had never needed to defend themselves before, and now they were helpless against the Krathan, who killed anyone who tried to resist and tortured those who surrendered. The message continued with Tal Eris describing how the Krathan had already destroyed 12 of their largest cities and captured hundreds of thousands of Villani, including many children who were being taken away to work in mines on other worlds where most of them would die from the harsh conditions. He begged any civilization that received his message to please send help because his people were running out of places to hide, and the Krathan were hunting them down systematically with the goal of either enslaving or killing every Villani on the planet within the next few months. Captain Dongsu immediately ordered Hye-jin to record everything and prepare a detailed report for Earth Command while he called an emergency meeting of his senior officers to discuss what they should do about this situation that no human had ever faced before. The meeting included Commander Kyung-ho, who was responsible for tactical operations and had studied military history from every nation on Earth, and Dr. Sun-mi, who specialized in alien biology and had prepared for the possibility of meeting other species during their mission. Also present was Master Sergeant Tae-hyun, who led the small marine unit aboard the ship, and Engineer Ji-hoon, who maintained their weapons and defense systems, along with Intelligence Officer Yeon-soo, who analyzed threats and gathered information about potential enemies. Captain Dongsu played the message for his officers and watched their faces as they listened to the desperation in Tal Eris' voice and learned about the suffering of an entire alien species that had never done anything to deserve such treatment. From their attackers, Commander Kyung-ho was the first to speak and said that based on what they were hearing, the Krathan Empire sounded like a military force that used overwhelming power and fear to conquer peaceful civilizations that could not defend themselves properly. Dr. Sun-mi added that the Villani seemed to be an aquatic species that had evolved in an environment where cooperation was more important than competition, which would explain why they had never developed military technology or warrior cultures like humans. Had Master Sergeant Tae-hyun pointed out that if the message was accurate, then the Krathan were committing genocide against an innocent population, and that every military code of ethics that humans had developed said that such actions should be stopped whenever possible. The officers debated their options, while Captain Dongsu transmitted the alien message back to Earth using their fastest communication systems and requested immediate orders from the Unified Defense Council, which was responsible for all human military operations outside the solar system. While they waited for a response from Earth, the Perseverance continued monitoring the alien transmissions and picked up more messages from other Volani, who were hiding in underwater caves and abandoned cities while trying to avoid the Krathan patrols that searched for survivors. The messages painted a picture of a beautiful world being systematically destroyed by invaders who took pleasure in causing pain and suffering to creatures who had never harmed anyone and who possessed technology and knowledge that could benefit the entire galaxy if they were allowed to survive. Admiral Boram responded from Earth Command within 6 hours and informed Captain Dong-Su that the message had been analyzed by experts who confirmed that it was genuine and that the situation described by Tal Eris was consistent with other intelligence that Earth had gathered about aggressive alien empires. Admiral explained that President Wu Jin was calling an emergency session of the Global Council to decide whether humanity should intervene in an alien conflict that was happening far from Earth and that involved species they knew nothing about, except for what they had learned from the distress calls. Some council members argued that humanity should focus on exploring and defending their own territory, rather than getting involved in galactic politics that might make enemies of powerful alien empires like the Krathan, who could threaten Earth if they became angry about human interference. But other council members pointed out that the Volani were asking for help against what appeared to be war criminals who were committing genocide, and that Earth had always stood against such actions throughout human history, regardless of the cost or risk involved. President Wu Jin listened to all arguments and consulted with military advisors who had studied the available information about Krathan technology and capabilities before making a decision that would change the course of human history and establish Earth as a major power in galactic affairs. The president announced that humanity would answer the Volani distress call and provide military assistance to stop the genocide on Aquaros, because allowing such crimes to continue without response would be a betrayal of everything that Earth stood for in terms of justice and protection of innocent life. Admiral Boram immediately began organizing a relief mission and asked Captain Dong-Su to volunteer for command of the operation since his ship was already in the area and his crew had the most experience with deep space operations and first contact protocols. Captain Dong-Su accepted the mission without hesitation and began preparing the Perseverance for what would be humanity's first military action against an alien enemy in a war that would test everything they had learned about fighting and dying for principles that were more important than their own safety. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Aquaros system, and Captain Dong-Su felt his stomach turn when he saw what the Krathan Empire had done to the beautiful water world that Tal Eris had described in his desperate messages to anyone who might listen. Where there should have been gleaming cities floating on clean blue oceans, there were now burning ruins sending black smoke into the atmosphere, while massive alien warships patrolled overhead like metal vultures waiting to strike at anything that moved below them. Commander Kyung-ho worked at his tactical station analyzing the enemy ships and counting at least 30 Krathan dreadnoughts, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, and bristling with weapons that could probably destroy an entire human city with a single blast. Dr. Sunmi monitored the life signs coming from the planet's surface and reported that millions of Volani were still alive, but their biological readings showed extreme stress and malnutrition, which meant they were suffering terribly under Krathan occupation and needed help immediately. The human ships advanced carefully toward the planet while trying to avoid detection by the Krathan patrols, and Captain Dong-Su ordered his communications team to send a message to any surviving Volani leaders using the same frequencies that Tal Eris had used for his original distress call. Within an hour, they received a response from someone who identified himself as Tal Eris, and who seemed shocked that anyone had actually answered their plea for help, since no other species in the galaxy had ever responded to Volani requests for assistance during previous emergencies. Tal Eris agreed to meet with the humans aboard their flagship, but warned that the Krathan were monitoring all movement on and around the planet, and that any rescue attempt would be extremely dangerous for both the humans and the remaining Volani survivors. The meeting took place in the main conference room of the Perseverance, where Captain Dong-Su and his senior officers waited nervously for their first face-to-face encounter with an intelligent alien species, while Dr. Sunmi prepared her translation equipment and medical scanners. when Tal Eris materialized in the transport beam. He was unlike anything the humans had imagined, with blue-green skin that seemed to shift colors based on his emotions, and large eyes that showed both intelligence and deep sadness from everything he had witnessed. His body was designed for life in water, with webbed hands and feet and gills along his neck that fluttered as he breathed the specially modified atmosphere that Dr. Sun-Mi had prepared for aquatic life forms like the Vellani, who needed more humidity. Then humans, through the universal translator, Tal Eris explained that his people had evolved on a world where cooperation and peaceful problem-solving were the keys to survival, and that they had never developed weapons or military technology because they had never encountered a species that wanted to hurt them. He described how the Krathen had arrived 6 months earlier, claiming to be traders who wanted to exchange technology and knowledge, but had immediately begun attacking Vellani cities. When they learned that the planet contained rare minerals that were valuable throughout the galaxy, the Krathen had demanded that all Vellani submit to slavery and work in underwater mining operations that were destroying the ocean ecosystems where his people had lived for millions of years, and that provided the food and shelter that kept their civilization alive. Those who refused to work were killed immediately, while those who agreed to become slaves were forced to labor in conditions that slowly poisoned them with toxic chemicals and killed them within a few years of starting work in the mines that the Krathen had built. Tal Eris showed the humans holographic images of what his world had looked like before the invasion, with beautiful coral cities that rose from the ocean floor and floating platforms where Vellani artists and scientists had created wonders that enhanced life for everyone. Now those same cities were either destroyed or converted into prison camps where Vellani families were separated and children were taken away to be trained as workers in other parts of the Krathen Empire where they would never see their parents again. The Krathen had also begun poisoning the breeding grounds where young Vellani developed, from eggs into adults. And this meant that even if some of his people survived the current genocide, their species might become extinct within a generation because they could not reproduce. Dr. Sun-Mi asked technical questions about Vellani biology and learned that they were an ancient species that had achieved advanced technology through biological sciences rather than mechanical engineering, and that their knowledge could help humanity understand how to create living ships and self-healing. Materials Commander Kyung-ho wanted to know more about Krathen military tactics and discovered that the invaders relied on fear and overwhelming force to defeat enemies who had never developed effective resistance strategies against such brutal and efficient killing machines. Tal Eris explained that the Krathen were part of an empire that had conquered dozens of star systems by attacking peaceful species who could not defend themselves, and that they seemed to enjoy causing pain and suffering, rather than simply taking what they wanted. The Krathen leader, Admiral Vex Gorth, had made it clear that his forces would kill every Vellani on the planet unless they surrendered completely and agreed to work as slaves for the rest of their lives. While watching their children grow up in captivity, Captain Dong-Su listened to everything with growing anger and finally asked Tal Eris to explain exactly what kind of help the Vellani needed from humanity and whether they would be willing to fight alongside human forces against their oppressors. Tal Eris admitted that his people had no experience with warfare and would not be effective soldiers, but that they could provide intelligence about Krathen operations and help human forces navigate the underwater cities where many Vellani were being held prisoner. He also offered to share Vellani technology with humanity, including their advanced life support systems and biological computers that could enhance human ships and weapons in ways that might give them an advantage against the more numerous Krathen forces. While they were talking, the Krathen detected the presence of human ships in the system, and Admiral Vex Gorth sent a message demanding that the unknown vessels identify themselves and explain their business in Krathen territory or face immediate destruction. Captain Dong-Su responded by identifying himself as a representative of Earth and stating that humanity had come to investigate reports of war crimes being committed against the Vellani people and to offer humanitarian assistance to the survivors. Admiral Vex Gorth laughed at this response and transmitted footage of Vellani executions that had been recorded for propaganda purposes, showing how the Krathen dealt with species that refused to submit to their authority and warning that humans would receive the same treatment. The Admiral demanded that all human ships leave the system immediately, or he would demonstrate the same level of mercy that he had shown to the Volani resistance fighters who had tried to protect their families from Krathen's soldiers. Captain Dong-Su looked at his officers and then at Tal Eris before responding with words that would be remembered throughout the galaxy for generations, as the moment when humanity announced its presence as a force for justice rather than conquest. He told Admiral Vex Gorth that the Krathen had made one critical mistake by hurting innocent people and asking humans to watch without taking action, because throughout their history humans had always fought against those who preyed on the weak and defenseless. The captain explained that Earth would not leave the system until every Volani had been freed from slavery and every war criminal had been brought to justice, regardless of how many ships the Krathen could bring to the fight or how advanced their technology might be. Admiral Vex Gorth responded by ordering his forces to attack the human fleet, and Captain Dong-Su gave the order that began humanity's first interstellar war fought not for territory or resources, but for the principle that genocide should never be tolerated anywhere in the universe. Admiral Vex Gorth had ruled the galaxy for decades by conquering peaceful species that had never learned to fight, and he expected the humans to flee like all the others when faced with the overwhelming firepower of 30 Krathen dreadnoughts that had never lost a battle. But Captain Dong-Su had studied every war in human history and understood something that the Krathen could not comprehend, which was that humans had evolved as hunters and warriors who turned violence into an art form. Through thousands of years of constant conflict, the first Krathen attack came exactly as Commander Kyung-ho had predicted, with massive energy beams designed to destroy entire cities, but the human ships scattered in patterns that confused the alien gunners who were used to fighting enemies that fled in straight lines. Master Sergeant Tae-hyun launched the first boarding pods, while the Krathen were still trying to target the dispersed human fleet, and his Marines used tactics that no alien military had ever encountered before, including stealth technology that made them nearly invisible. The Marines moved through Krathen ships like ghosts, using maintenance tunnels and service corridors that the aliens had never thought to defend because no previous enemy had been clever enough to find such hidden routes through their vessels. Tae-hyun and his men planted explosives at critical points throughout the enemy ships while avoiding direct combat whenever possible and using psychological warfare to make the Krathen crew believe they were facing an army instead of just 20 Marines. When the explosives detonated simultaneously, the Krathen lost 3 dreadnoughts before they realized what was happening, and Admiral Vex Gorth began to understand that humans fought differently than any species he had encountered in his long career of conquest. Engineer Ji-hoon had been studying Krathen technology from the wreckage of destroyed ships and discovered that their weapons were designed for overwhelming force rather than precision, which meant they were vulnerable to smaller, faster targets that could strike and disappear. He began modifying human missiles with alien power sources that increased their speed and destructive capability, while Dr. Sunmi worked with Volani survivors to understand the underwater cities where thousands of prisoners were being held by Krathen occupation forces. Intelligence Officer Yeon-su established contact with Volani resistance groups that had been hiding in deep ocean caves and began teaching them guerrilla warfare tactics that humans had perfected through centuries of fighting against superior numbers and technology. The resistance fighters learned to sabotage Krathen mining equipment and rescue captured Volani families using hit-and-run attacks that left the aliens confused and frustrated because they could not predict where the next strike would come. Captain Dong-Su implemented Protocol 7, which was a human military doctrine that prioritized saving civilian lives over achieving strategic objectives, and this confused the Krathen, who were used to enemies that focused only on military targets. Human pilots like Sung-woo began flying impossible rescue missions through Krathen defensive lines to evacuate Volani settlements, and these pilots took risks that seemed insane to alien observers who valued their own lives more than the lives of strangers. The Krathen had never faced an enemy that would sacrifice valuable ships and trained personnel to save civilians that belonged to a different species, and they began to realize that human motivations were completely different from their own. Admiral Vex Gorth tried to counter human tactics by threatening to execute prisoners whenever his forces were attacked, but this strategy backfired when Captain Dong-Su responded by accelerating rescue operations instead of slowing them down. The humans began using captured Krathen ships to approach prisoner camps without being detected, and Master Sergeant Tae-hyun developed new techniques for rapid extraction of large numbers of civilians while fighting off guards who were caught completely off guard. Commander Kyung-ho analyzed Krathen communication patterns and discovered that their military was organized like a rigid hierarchy where lower-ranking officers were afraid to make decisions without permission from their superiors, which created delays that humans could exploit. The human fleet began targeting Krathen command ships specifically to disrupt their chain of command and force individual captains to make tactical decisions they were not trained for while dealing with human attacks that followed no predictable pattern. Engineer Ji-hoon created new weapons by combining human military engineering with alien technology salvaged from destroyed Krathen ships, and these hybrid weapons proved to be far more effective than anything either species had developed independently. The most devastating innovation was a missile system that could think for itself using artificial intelligence that had been enhanced with Volani biological computing technology, and these smart weapons could adapt to Krathen defensive measures in real time. Dr. Sun-mi worked with rescued Volani scientists to understand how their biological technology could be integrated with human mechanical systems to create living ships that could repair themselves and grow stronger through battle experience, intelligence. Officer Yeon-soo discovered that the Krathen Empire controlled dozens of star systems through fear and oppression, and that many of the conquered species would rebel if they believed they had support from a powerful military force like Earth. Psychological impact of human success against the previously invincible Krathen began spreading throughout the galaxy as news of the battles reached other oppressed species who had been waiting for someone to stand up to the Empire. Admiral Vex Gorth realized that his forces were losing the initiative for the first time in his career, and he began making desperate attacks that violated his own military doctrine because humans had forced him into a type of warfare that favored adaptability over raw power. The Krathen had built their empire by following predictable strategies that worked against peaceful species, but humans had spent thousands of years fighting other humans who were equally intelligent and equally ruthless, which had forced them to develop superior tactics. Captain Dong-soo coordinated rescue operations that saved hundreds of thousands of Volani civilians while simultaneously destroying Krathen military assets, and this dual focus confused enemy commanders who could not understand how humans could accomplish both objectives. The tide of battle turned decisively when Master Sergeant Tae-hyun captured a Krathen admiral who revealed under interrogation that the Empire was spread thin across too many star systems, and that most of their forces were occupied with suppressing rebellions. Commander Kyung-ho used this intelligence to plan attacks on Krathen supply lines that left their forces on Aquaros without reinforcements or resupply, while human ships continued to arrive from Earth with fresh troops and equipment. The Krathen began to realize that they had made a terrible mistake by challenging a species that had evolved through constant warfare and had developed military technology specifically designed to defeat other intelligent opponents rather than helpless civilians. Admiral Vex Gorth sent desperate messages to other parts of the Krathen Empire requesting immediate reinforcements, but discovered that human attacks had disrupted communications throughout the galaxy, and that many Krathen fleets were dealing with their own emergencies. The human victory at Aquaros became inevitable when Captain Dong-soo received word that the full Earth fleet was approaching the system under the command of Admiral Bo-ram, who brought weapons and ships that represented the absolute pinnacle of human military development. The Krathen Empire was about to learn what happened when a species that had perfected the art of war decided that justice was more important than survival, and that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Admiral Bo-ram arrived at Aquaros with the entire Earth defense fleet, which included every warship that humanity had built since they first reached the stars, and the sight of 200 human vessels dropping out of hyperspace sent shockwaves through the Krathen Empire. The fleet included massive battleships that had been designed by studying every conflict in human history, from ancient naval battles to modern space warfare, and each ship carried weapons that could destroy entire fleets. Of conventional alien vessels, Captain Dong-soo watched from the bridge of the Perseverance as the flagship Indomitable took position at the center of the human formation, and he felt pride knowing that his species had answered the call when innocent people needed protection from genocidal monsters. Admiral Bo-ram transmitted a message to Admiral Vex Gorth demanding the immediate surrender of all Krathen forces and the release of every Volani prisoner, or else Earth would demonstrate why humans had never lost a war when they were fighting for justice. The Krathan admiral responded with arrogance and contempt, claiming that no species in the galaxy could challenge the might of an empire that had conquered dozens of star systems and enslaved billions of creatures over thousands of years. But Admiral Vex Gorth had never faced enemies who fought with the combined fury of every human warrior who had ever lived and died defending the innocent, and his confidence began to crack when he saw what Earth had brought to this battle. The human fleet included ships like the Retribution, which carried kinetic weapons that could punch through any known armor, and the Vengeance, which launched swarms of intelligent missiles that could hunt down targets hiding behind asteroids or space debris. Tactical Officer Min Seo coordinated attacks that demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of human military doctrine, with each ship knowing exactly what role it played in a strategy that had been developed through centuries of studying how to defeat larger and more powerful enemies. Strategic Coordinator Jae Wook used mathematical models that predicted Krathan movements with impossible accuracy because human military science had learned to analyze enemy psychology and use their own instincts and fears against them in battle. The first phase of the attack targeted Krathan communication networks and supply lines using weapons that the aliens had never encountered before, including electromagnetic pulse bombs that disabled their ships without destroying them completely. Dr. Yoon Young began broadcasting psychological warfare messages directly into Krathan communication systems using frequencies that triggered instinctual fear responses in their species while explaining exactly how humans intended to dismantle their empire. The psychological attacks were so effective that entire Krathan fleets began surrendering without firing a shot because their crews had been convinced that resistance was futile and that humans possessed supernatural powers. But the true wrath of Earth emerged when human reconnaissance teams discovered Krathan breeding facilities where they were using captured alien children to create genetically modified warrior slaves who would never question orders or rebel against their masters. Captain Dong Su felt sick when he saw the reports of what the Krathan had done to thousands of young beings from dozens of different species, including some who had been altered so extensively that they could barely be recognized as members of their original races. The discovery of the breeding facilities triggered something primal in human psychology, and President Wu Jin authorized Operation Righteous Fury, which was designed to completely destroy the Krathan Empire and ensure that such atrocities could never happen again. Admiral Boram received new orders that went far beyond saving the Villani, and now included hunting down every Krathan war criminal and liberating every slave camp and prison facility that the Empire had built throughout the galaxy. The human fleet split into task forces that struck simultaneously at Krathan installations across dozens of star systems using hyperspace jumps that brought overwhelming firepower to targets that had never been attacked before. Fleet Captain Sang Min led one task force to the Krathan industrial worlds, where they destroyed the factories that produced weapons and ships for the Empire, while rescuing millions of alien slaves who had been worked to death in horrible conditions. Commander So Young took another force to attack Krathan administrative centers, where they captured the bureaucrats and officials who had planned and organized the genocidal campaigns against peaceful species throughout the galaxy. The speed and coordination of human attacks left the Krathan completely unable to respond effectively because they had never developed strategies for defending against enemies who could strike anywhere at any time. Human Marines like Lieutenant Hyun Woo specialized in liberating prison camps, and they used techniques that had been perfected through studying historical rescue operations from every human culture that had ever fought against oppression. The freed slaves included representatives of species that the galaxy had assumed were extinct, and their testimonies revealed the full scope of Krathan crimes, which were far worse than anything that Tal Eris had described. In his original distress, Call Intelligence Officer Yeon Su coordinated with resistance movements on conquered worlds and provided them with weapons and training that allowed them to overthrow Krathan occupation forces and reclaim their homelands. The psychological impact of human success spread faster than the physical attacks, and Krathan forces throughout the galaxy began experiencing mass desertions as their soldiers realized that the Empire was collapsing and that continued resistance would only lead to their destruction. Admiral Vex Gorth tried to rally his remaining forces by threatening to destroy entire planets rather than allow them to be liberated, but this strategy backfired when his own officers began to question whether They wanted to be responsible for such massive atrocities. The Krathan military had been built on the assumption that superior technology and overwhelming numbers would always triumph over inferior enemies, but humans had proven that superior strategy and unbreakable will could overcome any technological advantage. Dr. Yun Young's analysis of Krathan psychology revealed that their entire culture was based on the belief that might made right, and that the strong had the natural right to dominate, the weak which made them unable to understand human motivations. The final phase of Operation Righteous Fury involved surrounding the Krathan homeworld of HFY, where the Empire government was located and where the ultimate decision-makers had planned and coordinated genocide across dozens of star systems. Admiral Boram assembled the largest human fleet in history for the final assault, including ships that had been built specifically for this battle using technology that combined the best of human engineering with innovations borrowed from every liberated species. The Krathan High Council sent desperate messages to other galactic powers begging for assistance against the human invasion, but discovered that their empire had made so many enemies that no one was willing to help them. Captain Dong-Su realized that humanity had reached a turning point where they could either become conquerors like the Krathan or something entirely different that the galaxy had never seen. Before the battle for HFY would determine not only the fate of the Krathan Empire, but also the future role that humans would play in galactic civilization, and whether Earth would be remembered as liberators or as just another group of tyrants with better weapons, Admiral Boram prepared to give the order that would begin the final assault, while President Wu Jin waited on Earth for news that would either establish humanity as the galaxy protector or mark the beginning of a new age of human imperialism. Fleet Admiral Sang Min led the combined human and allied armada in the final assault on HFY, while the entire galaxy watched to see whether Earth would become another conquering empire or something completely different that had never existed before. The battle above the Krathan homeworld lasted only 6 hours because the Empire forces had been shattered by human attacks across dozens of star systems, and most of their ships surrendered rather than face destruction by weapons. They could not understand or counter. Admiral Vexgorth made a final desperate attempt to destroy his own planet rather than allow it to be captured, but his own officers arrested him and handed him over to human forces because they refused to be responsible for the death of billions of innocent civilians. Captain Dong-Su stood on the bridge of the Perseverance, watching Krathan ships surrender one by one and feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, because war always brought both victory and tragedy even when fought for the best possible reasons. The moment that defined humanity, future came when Admiral Boram received surrender messages from the Krathan High Council and had to decide whether to accept their capitulation or continue fighting until every trace of their empire had been eliminated from the galaxy. President Wu Jin had given clear instructions that the goal was justice rather than revenge, and that meant treating even war criminals according to the laws and principles that made humanity different from the monsters they had defeated, instead of occupying HFY or demanding tribute from the defeated empire. Admiral Boram announced the establishment of war crimes tribunals that would prosecute Krathan leaders. While protecting innocent civilians who had played no role in the atrocities, Colonel He Wan arrived with a team of military lawyers and judges who had studied international law from every human culture and adapted those principles to create a legal framework that could handle crimes committed across multiple star systems. The trials revealed the full scope of Krathan brutality, including detailed records of every genocide and every slave camp that the Empire had operated over thousands of years of expansion and conquest throughout the galaxy. But the trials also revealed something that surprised many observers, which was that not all Krathan had supported their government policies, and that some had tried to resist or limit the worst atrocities despite facing punishment or death for their opposition. Colonel He Wan established procedures that distinguished between war criminals who had planned and executed genocide and ordinary citizens who had been forced to obey orders under threat of execution, and this distinction became a model for galactic justice. The psychological impact of human mercy toward defeated enemies was as shocking to galactic observers as their military efficiency had been, because no conquering species had ever established courts to judge their own actions as well as those of their enemies. Captain Dong-Su was promoted to admiral and given command of the newly created Galactic Protection Fleet, which included ships from Earth and vessels that had been captured from the Krathen and converted to serve humanitarian purposes. The fleet mission was to patrol the galaxy and respond to distress calls from any species that faced threats they could not handle alone, and this represented a completely new concept in galactic politics. Tal Eris spoke at the founding ceremony of the Galactic Protection Alliance, and his words became legendary throughout the galaxy as he described how his people had cried into the void for salvation and received an answer that exceeded their wildest hopes. He explained that humans had come not as conquerors seeking to replace one empire with another, but as guardians who fought to protect the innocent and then stepped back to allow liberated species to govern themselves. The alliance included representatives from every species that had been freed from Krathen rule, and they worked together to establish laws and procedures that would prevent future genocides while respecting the independence and cultural differences of member civilizations. Dr. Sunmi became the Alliance chief scientist and began coordinating research projects that combined the knowledge of dozens of species to solve problems that no single civilization could handle alone. Including disease outbreaks and natural disasters, Commander Kyung-ho established the Alliance Military Academy, where officers from different species learned human tactical doctrine and taught their own military traditions, creating a new type of warrior dedicated to protection rather than conquest. Master Sergeant Tae-hyun trained the first generation of Alliance Marines who came from dozens of different worlds and who swore an oath to defend the innocent regardless of their species or the danger involved in rescue operations. The Academy became famous throughout the galaxy for producing officers who combined human tactical brilliance with the specialized knowledge and abilities of other species, creating military forces that were more effective than anything that had existed before. Intelligence Officer Yeon-su created the Alliance Information Network, which monitored threats throughout the galaxy and provided early warning of potential conflicts before they could escalate into wars or genocides. Engineer Ji-hoon developed new technologies that combined human mechanical engineering with biological innovations from species like the Vellani, and the result was ships and weapons that were both more powerful and more ethical than previous designs. The Alliance established colonies on worlds that had been devastated by Krathen strip mining, and these colonies became showcases for how different species could work together to restore damaged ecosystems and create better lives for everyone. Captain So-young commanded one of the new patrol fleets that responded to emergencies throughout the galaxy, and her crews included volunteers from dozens of species who had all experienced liberation by human forces. Lieutenant Hyun-woo became famous for rescue operations that saved civilians from natural disasters and conflicts, and his techniques were studied at the Academy and adapted for use by officers from many different worlds. The Alliance faced its first major test when a new threat emerged from outside the galaxy, and species that had been enemies for thousands of years had to work together under human leadership to defend their shared civilization. But the greatest achievement of the Alliance was not military victory, but the establishment of a new principle in galactic politics, which was that advanced civilizations had a moral obligation to protect those who could not protect themselves. The human example inspired other species to examine their own histories and cultures, and many began adopting laws and customs that emphasized cooperation and justice rather than competition and domination. Admiral Dong-su established patrol routes that covered the entire galaxy and ensured that no species would ever again face genocide without hope of rescue from the Alliance fleet that had grown to include thousands of ships. The final scene of this transformation occurred when a new distress call reached Alliance headquarters from a species that was facing invasion by pirates, and Admiral Dong-su immediately dispatched rescue forces without hesitation or debate. Tal Eris watched the response from his position as Alliance Council chairman and realized that his people cry for help had not only saved the Vellani, but had changed the entire galaxy by proving that someone would always answer when the innocent called for aid. The Alliance motto became known throughout the galaxy as a promise that gave hope to every peaceful species and struck fear into the hearts of those who preyed on the weak, and it simply stated that Earth and its allies were the shield for those who could not protect themselves. Humanity had answered the alien cry for aid with their full wrath, but they had also demonstrated that true strength came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect strangers who shared nothing except their need for justice and mercy.